Sometime in 2011, two old men sat in a parked car in Queens, talking about the old days. One of them was Vincent Asaro, in his mid-70s, a capo in the Bonanno crime family. The other was his cousin, Gaspar Valenti, broke, desperate, and wearing an FBI wire under his shirt. Valenti sighed and said, "Look at what we come down to." And Asaro gave him an answer that would land in a federal courtroom 4 years later. He said, "We never got our right money, what we were supposed to get." Then he cursed out the man who shorted him. Jimmy. That Jimmy kept everything. Jimmy Burke, the man Robert De Niro played in Goodfellas. And the money Asaro was complaining about, more than 30 years after the fact, was his cut from the Lufthansa Heist. December 11th, 1978. Kennedy Airport. Roughly $5 million in cash and close to $1 million in jewelry. The biggest cash robbery in American history at the time. Here's the problem with that tape. Vincent Asaro is not in Goodfellas. Not a scene, not a line, not even a name on a wall. According to federal prosecutors, this man helped plan the score, sat outside the terminal that night, and collected $500,000 from it. And the most famous mob movie ever made acts like he doesn't exist. Meanwhile, the man the entire movie is built around, Henry Hill, was nowhere near that vault. He wasn't in the van. He wasn't holding a gun on cargo workers. He wasn't there. And here's the part almost nobody sits with. Everything you think you know about Lufthansa came from him anyway. For over 30 years, Henry Hill was the voice of the Lufthansa Heist. The books, the interviews, the documentaries, the movie. All of it flows through a man whose entire contribution to the robbery was a phone call and an introduction. This is the story of what Hill actually did that night, who the record says was really there, and how a guy who never set foot in that cargo terminal became history's official witness to it. Let's start with what Hill's role actually was, because it matters and it was real. It just wasn't what the legend turned it into. The heist didn't start with Jimmy Burke. It started with a Lufthansa cargo supervisor named Louis Werner. Werner had a gambling problem, the kind that eats a paycheck before it clears. By 1978, he owed around $20,000 to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman. Marty ran his book out of a wig shop in Queens. He was a talker, a schemer, a guy always looking for an angle to clear debt. Werner gave him one. Werner told Krugman that Lufthansa's cargo terminal at JFK regularly held huge amounts of untraceable American currency, cash flown back from Germany, money changed by servicemen and tourists overseas. Sometimes millions of dollars sat in that vault over a weekend, waiting for pickup. Werner knew the schedules. He knew the security. He knew the building. What he needed was a crew. Krugman couldn't rob an airport, but Krugman knew Henry Hill, and Henry Hill knew Jimmy Burke. That was Hill's job. That was the whole job. He was the pipe the information flowed through. Krugman brought him the tip. Hill carried it to Burke at Robert's Lounge, and Burke took it from there. Burke picked the crew. Burke planned the approach. Burke handled the inside man through his own people. Once the tip changed hands, Henry Hill's usefulness to the Lufthansa operation was essentially over. On the night of December 11th, 1978, while 6 armed men walked into the Lufthansa cargo building at around 3 in the morning, Henry Hill was home. By his own account, he found out the score had gone down the way the rest of New York did, after the fact. In Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, the book Goodfellas is based on, Hill never claims to have been inside. Even Scorsese understood this. People have asked for decades why the most famous heist movie ever made never shows the heist. The answer is simple. The movie is told through Henry's eyes, and Henry's eyes were closed in bed in Rockville Center when it happened. He was supposed to get paid anyway. A tip like that earns points, and his points ran through Krugman. Then Burke started killing people. Krugman disappeared in January 1979, about 5 weeks after the robbery, reportedly because he wouldn't stop demanding his $500,000 finder's fee. And when Marty Krugman vanished, so did Henry Hill's Lufthansa money. Think about that. The man who became the face of the Lufthansa heist probably never collected a meaningful dime from it. Now flip the picture. While Hill was waiting on money that never came, who was actually at that airport? Start with the name the movie never says. Vincent Asaro. Born in Ozone Park in 1935, third-generation Bonanno family. His grandfather was connected. His father was connected. Asaro had the words death before dishonor tattooed on his forearm, and he meant it. By the late 1970s, he was a rising figure in the Bonanno crew that controlled rackets around Kennedy Airport. And that detail is the key to everything, because in the mob's geography, JFK wasn't open territory. The Bonannos considered the airport theirs. Jimmy Burke was a Lucchese associate. He could not walk a hijacking crew into Bonanno territory and empty a vault without cutting in the family that ran the ground he was standing on. According to the government's case, that's where Asaro came in. He was the Bonanno stake in the score. How do we know? Because decades later, the people around Asaro started talking, and the FBI started recording. Gaspar Valenti walked into an FBI office in 2008. He wasn't wearing a badge of conscience. He was broke. Decades of gambling and bad luck had left him with nothing, and his famous cousin treated him like a nuisance. So Valenti made a deal. The Bureau paid him, and in exchange he wore a wire around Vincent Asaro for years, from roughly 2010 into 2013, catching an old capo reminiscing about things old capos should never say out loud. In 2015, at Asaro's trial in Brooklyn federal court, Valenti testified under oath about the night of December 11th, 1978. He said Asaro personally invited him onto the score, telling him Jimmy Burke had something big coming at the airport. He described the crew taking around 50 boxes from a vault, each one holding $125,000, plus a container of jewelry. He described the feeling afterward as euphoric, and he placed Asaro at the scene that night, waiting near the terminal in a crash car, a vehicle positioned to intercept police if the alarm went up early. Then came Sal Vitale, a former Bonanno underboss turned government witness. Vitale testified that after the robbery, he watched Asaro deliver an attaché case to Joseph Messino, the future boss of the Bonanno family. Messino opened it and found it packed with gold chains. Vitale said Messino told him, "This is from the Lufthansa score." Prosecutors argued Asaro's total take was around $500,000, much of which he burned at the racetrack. Messino himself, the highest-ranking American mobster ever to flip, was on the government's witness list too. The Fed said Asaro had admitted his Lufthansa involvement to Messino back when Messino was still the boss. So set the two ledgers side by side. On one side, Henry Hill, related tip, stayed home, got stiffed, told the story for 30 years. On the other side, Vincent Asaro, placed at the airport by a sworn witness, tied to the proceeds by a former underboss, caught on tape complaining about his cut, and completely absent from the most watched account of the crime ever produced. Why isn't Asaro in Goodfellas? The honest answer is structural. Goodfellas is not a documentary about Lufthansa. It's an adaptation of one man's life story, and that man was a Lucchese associate. Henry Hill could only tell you what Henry Hill saw, and Henry Hill saw the Lucchese side of the street. The Bonanno layer of the deal, the airport tax, the crash car, the attaché case going up the chain to Messino, none of that ran through Hill. He wasn't senior enough to be in those rooms, and he wasn't at the airport to see who was parked outside. When Pileggi built Wise Guy from Hill's memory, whatever Hill didn't know simply fell out of history. And for a generation, Hill's memory was the history. Which brings us to the strangest chapter of this whole thing. Hill's second career. Henry Hill entered witness protection in 1980 and spent the rest of his life getting thrown out of it and monetizing his past. He did books, radio, documentaries, paid appearances, even sold his paintings online. And Lufthansa was always the crown jewel of the brand. He was introduced on television for decades as the Goodfellas guy, the Lufthansa insider, the man who knew where the bodies were buried. Some of that was fair. He genuinely knew Burke. He genuinely lit the fuse by passing the tip. He genuinely watched the crew get slaughtered one by one in 1979. But over 30 years of retellings, the line between what Hill witnessed and what Hill heard secondhand got sanded away. His final book on the subject, The Lufthansa Heist, written with Daniel Simone and published in 2015, 3 years after Hill's death, presented itself as the definitive inside account. In it, Hill maintained that everyone who took part in the robbery was long dead, which conveniently made his version the last word, since no participant was left alive to dispute it. Except one was. Vincent Asaro was alive, in a Brooklyn courtroom, that same year being tried for that same heist. And here's the detail that should bother you. Simone, Hill's own co-author, later said Hill told him flatly that Asaro had no involvement in the robbery. Asaro isn't mentioned anywhere in their book. Simone even noted that the retired investigators he consulted never brought the name up. Now hold those two things in your head at once. Federal prosecutors, backed by a wired informant, a former underboss, and years of recordings, put Asaro at the airport with a $500,000 share. Henry Hill, the world's designated Lufthansa expert, said the man wasn't involved at all. Both of those cannot be fully true. Either the government's witnesses invented an entire Bonanno dimension to the heist, or the official narrator of the Lufthansa story didn't actually know who was there that night. There's no shame in the second option, by the way. Crews were compartmentalized on purpose. Burke didn't hold a staff meeting. A mid-level associate like Hill hearing about the score afterward would know the Lucchese names being whispered at Robert's lounge and nothing about a Bonanno capo in a car down the road. But it means the account America treated as gospel was a partial view, told with total confidence, repeated for 3 decades, until repetition made it feel complete. So why did the FBI keep leaning on Henry Hill at all? Look at the scoreboard because it's brutal. In nearly half a century, exactly one person was ever convicted for the Lufthansa heist. Louis Werner, the inside man. And he was convicted in May 1979, months before Hill ever flipped, based on his own associates informing on him. Werner got 15.5 years for setting up the robbery from inside the cargo terminal. Henry Hill's cooperation, which began in the spring of 1980, never convicted a single person for Lufthansa. Not one. His information about the heist was almost entirely hearsay, things Jimmy told him, things he picked up around the lounge, and hearsay doesn't survive a courtroom. What Hill's testimony actually did was take down Burke and Paul Vario on other charges. Burke went away for the Boston College basketball point shaving scheme, and later for the murder of Richard Eaton. Vario went down for fraud connected to Hill's parole. Burke died in prison in 1996 without ever being convicted for the robbery that made him a legend. The government used Hill because he was what they had. He could map the crew, explain the structure, connect faces to names, and put Burke behind bars for something. And once the movie came out in 1990, Hill had a second kind of value. He was a story the public couldn't get enough of, and the Bureau's greatest airport case lived on through him, unsolved but unforgotten. Nobody in law enforcement had much incentive to point out that their star narrator had watched the whole thing from his living room. Then, in 2014, it looked like the record would finally get corrected. On January 23rd, agents arrested Vincent Asaro, 78 years old, outside his home. The same investigation had dug up the basement of Jimmy Burke's old house in South Ozone Park the previous summer and found human remains. DNA matched Paul Katz, a warehouse owner who vanished in 1969 after Burke suspected him of talking to police. Valenti told agents that Asaro and Burke had strangled Katz with a dog chain, and that decades later Asaro had the body dug up and moved when heat came around. On top of the Katz murder, the indictment charged Asaro with racketeering built around Lufthansa itself. For the first time ever, a man was going to stand trial as one of the actual heist participants. The trial ran in the fall of 2015. The jury heard the tapes. They heard Valenti describe the vault, the boxes, the crash car. They heard Vitali describe the gold chains. They heard about the dog chain and the basement. The defense answer was simple and effective. Every witness against this man is a paid liar buying his way out of his own crimes. Valenti had taken government money for years. Vitali and Messino were killers who traded testimony for leniency. On November 12, 2015, the jury acquitted Vincent Asaro on every count. He pumped his fist, walked out of the courthouse, threw his arms in the air, and shouted that he was free. Prosecutors had spent 6 years building the case and lost all of it in an afternoon. And that acquittal locked in the final, absurd shape of Lufthansa history. Nobody, not one person, was ever convicted for physically robbing that terminal. The only conviction ever recorded belongs to the desk man who leaked the schedule. Roughly $6 million was never recovered. At least 6 people connected to the score were murdered within months of it. And the version of events that filled the vacuum for 30 years came from a man who was asleep when it happened. Asaro, for what it's worth, couldn't stay out of trouble. In 2017, he pleaded guilty to ordering a car torched in a road rage dispute and took an 8-year sentence at age 82. He was released on compassionate grounds in 2020 and died a few years later, taking whatever he actually knew about December 11th, 1978 with him. Here's the lesson buried in all of this, and it's bigger than one heist. In organized crime, and honestly in history generally, the record doesn't belong to the people who did the thing. It belongs to whoever survives long enough to tell it and is willing to talk. Jimmy Burke made sure the men in that vault never spoke. He killed the story at the source, one body at a time. And into that silence walked the one guy with a secondhand version, a book deal, and nothing left to lose. Henry Hill didn't lie about being at Lufthansa. Read him carefully, and he never quite claims it. What he did was subtler and more durable. He let 30 years of cameras assume it. He answered every Lufthansa question like an eyewitness, wrote the definitive account of a room he never stood in, and declared every real participant dead, while at least 2 of them were still walking around Queens. The movie did the rest. Once Ray Liotta's face became the heist belonged to Henry Hill. The men who were actually there got nothing. No credit, no convictions, and in most cases, no grave anyone can visit. Asaro said it best himself, sitting in that car, not knowing the world would ever hear him. They never got their right money. Jimmy kept everything. He was talking about the cash. He could just as easily have been talking about the story. If this changed how you see Goodfellas, hit subscribe because there's a new mob documentary here every week, and tap the like button so this one finds the people who grew up on that movie. And drop a comment. If Asaro's jury got it wrong, that means the only man ever tried for the Lufthansa robbery walked, and the only man who profited from its story was never there. Which of those bothers you more? Let me know below. Until next time,